Everybody knows the gun that won the West, the Colt Peacemaker, pulled from a holster. The hammer fanned, the bad guy drops. Here's the problem. The man doing the drawing couldn't afford it. A Peacemaker ran $16, $17 in 1875. A working cowhand made $25, maybe $30 a month, half his pay or better. He didn't buy one. By most accounts, he carried something cheaper, a beat-up Civil War-surplus revolver going for a few dollars, the gun Hollywood has never once put on a poster. Colt built about 192,000 Peacemakers by 1900. One company you've never heard of, making the cheapest guns in America, outsold that by most estimates several times over. And it's sitting at number 1. So today we're counting down the 10 guns that actually armed the frontier, ranked by how many existed, not how they looked on a poster. Number 10. The Colt 1860 Army, the gun that fought the Civil War and then refused to retire. 44 caliber, 6 shots, and lighter in the hand than the monster Colt Dragoon it replaced. The Dragoon was a 4-pound saddle cannon, a gun you hung off a horse, not off your belt. The 1860 you could actually wear, and it was an army pistol a whole generation of men already knew cold, because the army had drilled them on it and marched them across a continent with it on their hip. Colt built better than 200,000 before 1873, and the Union alone bought around 127,000, by a wide margin the most issued revolver of the war. Now do the math on what happens next. Hundreds of thousands of men are mustered out, and most of them do not mail their revolvers back. They drift west looking for work, and the gun on the hip is the 1860 Army, already paid for, already familiar, already sighted in. Every prestige gun on this list came later, invented for a frontier this one was already policing. It isn't here because it was the best revolver ever made. It's here because it got there first, on the belt of a man who just spent 4 years learning to trust it. Number 9. The Remington New Model Army, the one everybody calls the 1858, a year Remington never stamped on it. That name comes from a patent date collectors latched onto decades later, and what Remington built was, honestly, the smarter revolver. A Colt of this era had an open frame, the barrel held on by a wedge, the whole thing flexing a little every time you fire it. Remington ran a solid steel strap over the top of the cylinder. One piece. Stronger gun, held its zero better. And here's the part the shooters already know. You could knock the cylinder out of a Remington in seconds and drop in a fresh, preloaded one, a reload measured in a breath or two, not the minute plus it took to pour powder and seat 6 balls one at a time. A trooper with a spare cylinder in his pocket was carrying something close to a spare magazine 30 years before magazines. It came home by the tens of thousands as cheap surplus, got converted to metallic cartridges, and went straight back to work. Better frame, better reload, the more advanced design. And it still finished a distant second to Colt in sales and in fame. The gun that was everywhere is almost never the gun that was best. Number 8. The Spencer Carbine, the repeater the Army actually bought. Everybody remembers the Henry, the 16-shooter, the Yankee rifle you loaded on Sunday and fired all week. Great line. But the government bought fewer than 2,000 Henrys. Never general issue, just a couple of cavalry units and soldiers buying their own out of pocket. The Spencer, the Army bought by the freight carload. 7 shots from a spring-loaded tube that fed up through the buttstock, a fat 56-56 rimfire cartridge, and a lever you dropped to chamber a round. During the war, the government bought better than 94,000 carbines and 12,000 rifles, and Lincoln himself is said to have test-fired one near the White House and pushed to get them into service. Across the whole run, more than 200,000 were built. Then the war ended and the surplus dam broke. Thousands dumped onto the civilian market at a fraction of new price, exactly the discount a homesteader could stretch to. The cavalry carried them into the early Indian Wars, and settlers ordered them out of catalogs. The Henry got the legend and the movie close-ups. The Spencer got the contract, the battlefields, and the numbers. That's the trade this whole channel is about. Quick heads up before we go on. The higher we climb this list, the cheaper the guns get. That's not a coincidence. It's the answer. Subscribe. And tell me in the comments which of these you thought would rank higher. Number 7. The Sharps 1874. A single-shot falling block rifle, 9 or 10 pounds, double-set triggers. You tap the back trigger to set the front one so light that a breath fires it. Chambered for black powder cartridges that would kill anything on the continent. At Adobe Walls in 1874, a hunter named Billy Dixon knocked a man off a horse at close to 1,500 yards, usually put at 1,538, with a borrowed Sharps, a shot people still argue about. And that reach is exactly the problem. You'll hear that 120,000 Sharps rifles were made. But that figure is every Sharps, every model, across decades. The 1874 sporting rifle, the true buffalo gun, was a far smaller run. One careful count puts it under 6,500. Sit with that. What those few thousand rifles did does not match their number. A skilled hide hunter could sit hundreds of yards off a herd, out past where the animals registered any threat, and drop them one at a time. A stand, they called it, until his barrel was too hot to touch. Dozens in an afternoon. Working in crews, they shot the southern bison herds down from millions of animals to near nothing in a handful of years. And this was not an accident of commerce the government regretted. The Army understood exactly what the herds meant. Destroy the buffalo, and you destroy the commissary, the clothing, the shelter, and the independence of every Plains nation that lived on them. So it was encouraged. General Philip Sheridan is on record saying almost exactly that. The hide hunters were doing more to settle the Indian question than the whole army combined. The wording shifts in the retellings, but the sentiment is his. A few thousand rifles, millions of animals gone. And the people who had lived on those herds for centuries were starved onto the reservations. That was not a side effect. That was the plan, and the Sharps was the tool. Number 6. The Smith & Wesson Model 3 and its Army cousin, the Schofield. The gun that should have won the government contract and shot itself in the foot instead. Watch the difference. To reload a Colt, you thumb the hammer to half cock, open a little gate, and push the empties out one at a time with a rod while you feed fresh rounds in one at a time. The Smith & Wesson breaks open on a hinge, and as it opens, a star-shaped extractor kicks all 6 empty cases out at once. Drop 6 fresh in, snap it shut. That's not a little faster. It's a different category of fast. Major George Schofield reworked the design so a cavalryman could do the whole thing one-handed, in the saddle, at a gallop, with the reins in his other fist. The family sold on the order of 163,000, the same league as the Peacemaker. So what killed it? Ammunition. The Schofield was built around a shorter .45 cartridge. A Colt would happily chamber the short Schofield round, but a Schofield would not chamber the longer Colt round. So the moment a supply wagon rolled up loaded with Colt ammunition, every Schofield in the unit turned into a very expensive club. The Army even built a whole new, shorter .45 round to feed both guns at once, solved it on paper. Didn't matter. The Colt was simpler, tougher, easier to keep running in the field, and the Schofield contracts dried up. The better mousetrap lost to the one that never broke. And yes, Jesse James is said to have carried one. But most Jesse James gun stories are exactly that, stories. Believe the cartridge problem instead. It's better sourced than the outlaw. Number 5. The Springfield Trapdoor. Forget revolvers for a second. This is the gun the Army actually put in the most hands. Single shot, .45-70. A .45 caliber bullet over 70 grains of black powder, a round that hit like a fence post, with a hinged breech block that flips up and forward like a little trapdoor to load. Not a repeater. And that was a choice, not a failure. In 1873, the Army had already seen Winchesters and Spencers, and picked a single shot anyway. The logic was cold, and it was about supply. A single shot was accurate at long range. It hit far harder than a pistol-caliber repeater, and a soldier couldn't hose away 40 rounds a mule train hundreds of miles from a railhead could never replace. One aimed shot at a time was a feature to the men writing the budget. They built roughly 568,000 across 20 years, and it was the standard long arm through most of the Indian Wars. It also carries one famous accusation. At the Little Bighorn, in 1876, some of Custer's men may have had their copper cartridge cases swell and stick in a hot breach, forcing them to pry the spent case out with a knife blade while the fight went the wrong way around them. You'll see that offered as the reason the command was wiped out. Historians are more careful. A lot went wrong on that field, and the jamming was probably a small part of a total disaster. But the complaint was real, and it's in the records. 500,000 rifles that armed the frontier army for 2 decades. And the one afternoon everybody remembers is the afternoon a few of them jammed. Number 4. The Winchester, 1873. The gun that won the West. Now, that is a real quote, stamped on the myth so hard it became the title of movies. And here is where it actually comes from. Not a cowboy, not a lawman, not the frontier at all. A Winchester executive named Edwin Pugsley coined it as advertising copy in 1919. Read the tense, 1, past tense, because by 1919 the frontier was 3 decades dead and buried, and Winchester was in the business of selling the grandsons of frontiersmen a rifle wrapped in their grandfather's nostalgia. Now, the rifle earned some of that honestly. It was a genuine favorite of hunters, ranchers, and lawmen, and its best trick was ammunition sharing. Chamber your Winchester in the same .44-40 as your revolver, and you carried one kind of cartridge for both guns, a real advantage 100 miles from a store. And they sold better than 720,000 over the full run. That's a lot of rifle, but a favorite is not a universal standard. The most famous gun name of the American frontier got its legendary slogan from a marketing department in a boardroom 40 years after the frontier was over. That's not the West winning. That's Madison Avenue in a Stetson. Number 3. The Colt 1851 Navy, the one that quietly wrecks the entire Peacemaker story. 36 caliber, open top, beautifully balanced, and the best-selling Colt revolver of the frontier era, years before the Peacemaker even existed. This was the gun of the 1850s and 60s. The sidearm Civil War officers bought with their own money because it pointed like a finger. Wild Bill Hickok wore a matched pair tucked into a sash, butts forward, and drew them with a reverse twist of the wrists. Robert E. Lee is reported to have carried one. Colt built roughly 215,000 at Hartford, plus 42,000 at the London Works. Call it 250,000 guns, cap and ball. Now hold that against the star of the show. The Peacemaker reached only about 192,000 by 1900. So this humble percussion navy, the thing the movies treat as primitive, the muzzle you pour powder into, outsold the legendary single-action Colt by tens of thousands on older technology, a full generation earlier. The gun that supposedly won the West was outsold by its own grandfather, and almost nobody has heard its name. Number 2. The double-barrel shotgun. If you want to know what hung over the most doors on the frontier, over the fireplace, behind the shop counter in the corner of the soddy, it wasn't a Colt and it wasn't a Winchester. It was a plain side-by-side shotgun, and it wasn't close. Cheap, dead simple, nothing to go wrong, and it did every job a frontier family needed doing. Birdshot put quail and rabbits on the table on a Monday. Buckshot put a wall of lead across a doorway on a Saturday night, and inside a room, in bad light, by a man who'd never had time to practice. A shotgun did not require you to aim like Wild Bill. It required you to point. Ask a historian for the single most common firearm on the American frontier, and this is the answer, across every trade there was. Settlers, lawmen, express guards, ranchers, miners. Saw the barrels down to 18 or 20 inches, and you had the coach gun. The shortened double the man up top on a Wells Fargo stage cradled across his knees, which is where riding shotgun comes from, a phrase you still say without thinking. And at the OK Corral in 1881, the gun Doc Holliday carried in is usually described as a coach gun. Accounts differ on the gauge and the maker, but nobody disputes his most dangerous weapon that day was a shotgun. The most famous gunfight in history, and the deadliest thing on the lot, wasn't a six-shooter. It was the boring gun. And nobody stamped a proud American name on most of them, because hardware stores imported them by the crate. Cheap, sturdy doubles out of Belgium and England, sold under a store's own name or none at all. Which is exactly why the gun that was truly everywhere is the gun nobody brags about owning. No romance in a shotgun, just a body count. Number 1. The cheap pocket revolver. There's no single famous model to point at, and that is precisely the point. It's a whole class of gun. The little top break and solid frame revolvers collectors today call suicide specials. Nobody on the frontier called them that. A collector coined the nickname in 1948 as a punchline about how cheaply they were made. In 1885, there was no punchline. They were just the cheapest gun in the store, $1 or $2, small enough to disappear into a coat pocket or a lady's handbag or a shopkeeper's cash drawer. For a man who didn't have half a month's wages to hand Colt, that price tag wasn't a compromise. It was the whole decision. Now here's the number that ends the argument. Colt made about 192,000 Peacemakers by 1900. The gun on every poster, in every movie. Iver Johnson, one company in that same low-rent business, is estimated to have sold 4 to 6 million handguns across its history. Nobody kept a clean ledger for guns this cheap, so treat that as an estimate, not a receipt. But even the most conservative piece holds up alone. Their safety hammerless line ran to very close to 1 million guns. One product line outran the entire Peacemaker production several times over. Now stack Harrington and Richardson on top of it, and Hopkins and Allen, and the dozen other outfits stamping the same cheap iron out by the trainload, and the arithmetic isn't close. It's not even the same sport. There were a fistful of Sharps, 250,000 Navies, and if you were lucky, a Peacemaker in the sheriff's holster. There were millions upon millions of these. The gun that actually armed the American public was never on a poster, and never on a screen. It was a plain, cheap, forgettable revolver. In a dresser drawer, in a cash box under the counter, bought by the millions by people who appear in exactly none of your westerns because they were too busy working to become legends. So, the gun that won the West. That was marketing, and it always was. A slogan a Winchester man wrote in a boardroom in 1919, and the movies ran with it for a century. The real answer is quieter and a lot less handsome. A plain double-shot gun over a door, and a $2 pocket revolver in a drawer, bought by the millions by people nobody thought was worth putting in a picture. That's the frontier that actually existed underneath the one you were sold. Now it's your turn. Guns like these didn't end up in museums behind velvet rope. They ended up in attics and gun safes and sock drawers, and a lot of them are still in the family. So if your grandfather left you one, a trapdoor, a Navy Colt, some beat-up little pocket revolver with initials scratched into the grip, tell me about it in the comments. Make, caliber, and who carried it. The best story gets pinned. If you want the real hardware of the frontier, the guns behind the myths, not the ones on the poster, that's the whole point of this channel. Consider subscribing. There's a lot more frontier where the paperwork disagrees with the poster. See you on the next trail.